Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Rock Your Shine After You've Been Cracked Wide Open. Thank you again, my listeners, for showing up this week. I am I'm deeply honored actually for my guest this week. I'm going to read her short bio and then we are going to jump right into what I know is going to be an enlightening and very rich conversation today. So let me introduce to you Nanci Reed. Nanci, she is a sacred embodiment coach, author, intuitive healer, Pilates instructor, and a longtime student, teacher, and facilitator of A Course in Miracles. Nanci supports successful, empathic, and mission driven women to embrace their perfectly imperfect self with curiosity and gentleness. So they learn to trust the wisdom of their soul, live from their dreams, not their perceived limitations, and live there happily ever now, not after everything else is perfect, which is also the title of a book that she has written and recently published. So, Nanci, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's lovely to be here.
Well, I'll just tell my listeners that I had a hard time deciding where to go with this interview because I feel like I could do a whole series on just your life experiences from your near-death experiences to losing one of your deepest mentors, Kenneth Warmack. Is it Warmack? That's his last name.
Wapnick. Wapnick.
Wapnick, who was a longtime teacher of A Course in Miracles, right? Was he also author? He wasn't the only author
He
of, was he?
no, A Course in Miracles wasn't really authored. It was like they like to say it
Into
was
channeled.
scribed.
Yeah, channeled.
Yeah, scribed. And he was there before it got put into an actual publication. So he was there from the very probably in the middle of it, taking it down, basically towards the end of the finishing of the scribing. And then he helped with actually putting it into a format because it was all in these shorthand notes that were typed up after Dr. Helen
That
Schuckman,
yes, that's what
the
I was.
one
Yeah.
that worked at Columbia, University with her mentor herself, which was Dr. William Thetford. So they were both in the psychology department there. And they had been doing this kind of ritual where Helen would do her scribing and then she would bring in these steno pads because she knew how to take shorthand what she had written, and then Bill would sit with her and they would type it up. And so they had these huge binders basically of just this 7 years of dictation, that inner dictation that she had put down into shorthand, and then they transcribed it into the actual book. And then when Ken came on the scene, he actually helped to go through all of these pages and put some cohesiveness to it and turn it into an actual book. And so he was there from the get go. And so he was the original Course in Miracles teacher. And he had a foundation called the Foundation for A Course in Miracles, FACIM, and it's still around even after his passing.
Thank you for that because I've done the Course in Miracles, and for any of you who may not be aware of it, please look it up. It'll be one of the most powerful books you will ever read. And so thank you for that because I didn't have all of that history. So I don't know where, I think that you and I talked. Why don't we start with you had a near-death experience prior
Mm.
to prior to your relationship with Ken, correct? It led you to him. Yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, I did. So I was in a car accident where I was the passenger, and I wasn't driving the car, but I was a passenger, and we went over a cliff. And when we went over that cliff, I had this sensation of, they talk about that you see your whole life flash before your eyes when people have talked about near death experiences. Well, for me, what was really interesting, and all this happened just within moments, and yet I can recall it with such clarity and such vividness and lucidity too, is that I saw, instead of my whole life flash before me, all I saw were any examples of relationships or situations where there had been some sort of unkindness or resentment or an unhealed aspect to that relationship. And that's all I saw, whether it was intentional or not on my part. And so I saw like my best friend and I at the time, we had a falling out because I didn't go to her wedding and I was supposed to originally be in it. And then I didn't even go to it. And the reason I didn't go to it was that I was having all of this social anxiety that I was dealing with as somebody who has always been highly empathic and had been trying to, kind of hide that part of myself for so long. And so the thought of going to a wedding at that point in my life just seemed overwhelming. It seemed like that, even though it was my friend's big day, and I was highly embarrassed and I couldn't tell her the real reason for me not going. And so I made up some flimsy excuse about like that my new job in public relations that I was currently, working at that time, that they had said that I couldn't take vacation or something like that. And I put it back on the company. And so she didn't quite believe me 100%. And it really put a big rift in our relationship. And so I saw that experience like in those scenes that were being shown to me. And it was almost like I was watching like a movie projector or something like that. And it was just this stream of things where all the commonality that carried between them was that there was some sort of unkindness, whether it was intentional or not. And I remember thinking, as I saw this, I was like, why am I being shown this? Like, what is the significance of this as we're going over the edge of this cliff? Like, why is this the last thing I'm going to see before I die? Why? Like, what is the purpose of this? And it was very, very, very just clear, almost like it was imprinted into my memory that I was seeing at that moment. And so as we're going over the edge of the cliff and then we landed and all this dirt came in the car because the window was rolled down. And so I literally felt like I was buried. So that was weird. And I thought I had died. And then when I realized that I hadn't died, I started trying to get away from the car because the driver seemed fine. And I didn't really want to be around him at that point because it turned out that he'd been drinking and I didn't know it. And so bad date for sure. And I was crawling up. There was no cell phone reception. It was getting dark by that point. And so I was crawling up on this hill and grabbing onto anything I could to not fall down. And all of a sudden, these headlights come around the corner of the road. And we were out in kind of the middle of nowhere. So it was like a 2-directional road, but it only had one lane. Okay. So it wasn't very many, people didn't really travel it very much. It was kind of like a commuter's like side road that people sort of knew about. So this big white truck comes around the corner and I see these headlights and it stops. And I was like, oh, thank goodness, somebody's going to be here to help us. And so at that point, I'm like, crawling up, trying to get to the road, holding on to whatever I can, not knowing how injured I actually was, that I separated my right AC joint in my shoulder. I twisted my thoracic spine. And I also happened to be crawling through poison oak. So on top of everything else, I have a terrible case of poison oak that's going to be greeting me. Yes, down the road. And so anyways, the door to the truck opens up and this like hulking voice just pierces the silence. And, this guy just says, are you okay? Like, well, what happened? Like, is everyone else okay? And I was like, yeah, I'm okay, I think. And he seems to be okay. And he was crawling up, kind of behind me or whatever. And he said, well, you've got to get up back up here then, how can I help you? And I was like, well, I'm climbing up as hard as I can, but I just can't seem to get up to the top. And he said, well, you have to reach up and then I can just pull you back up. And I was like, I can't reach up. I'm going to fall if I do that. Like, there's no way, because I was on the slant and holding on for everything I could. The poison oak, it turns out. And then he said, I'll never forget this. And I say this in my book too, because the words stuck with me, where he said, I've got you, baby girl. Sometimes in life, you need to let go in order to be saved. And so I took this huge deep breath and I reached up my arm into the darkness, not knowing what was there or if anything was going to catch me. And his arms and his hands gripped my arm and pulled me up to the road. And so he was literally like my guardian angel. And it turned out that he was
I feel like, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm so overwhelmed with emotion. I feel like Because at first I was wondering if this person was real or if it was an angel, but I think it was an
Yeah.
angel in a real body, right?
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. And he was a contractor that had driven down from another state to do work in the area. And when they were coming around the corner, he and this other guy that were riding together, they actually caught my hair in their headlights and they thought that I was like a deer or something. And then they realized that this deer was wearing clothing and they're like, well, that can't be a deer. And so they stopped and then they realized somebody needed help. And we did. And we didn't have any cell phone reception. It was, terrible, like everything like that. And so he stayed long enough to basically wait with us until we had the people come to tow the car. And so all of that happened and I, tried to get his information and then literally it's like they were gone and I never saw them again. And so I don't know even his name or anything like that, but he was there. And so all of that happened. And then afterwards, all the adrenaline began to let go and, leave my body basically that had kept me not feeling the pain. And I felt it. And so the next morning I woke up and because I didn't go to the hospital or anything. I mean, I was like in so much shock from what had happened. And the guy that I was with didn't want us to. And so I was living with my aunt and uncle at the time. And I went to their house. And luckily he's a physical therapy expert and a doctor of physical therapy. And so in the morning when I went out to have breakfast, this is how like out of it I was. I hadn't taken a shower. I hadn't anything. I was still in the clothes that I had been in the accident in. And he's looking at me and he's like, so what happened last night? And I was like, oh, I was in a car accident. And he was like, oh, I think we better get you to the hospital. And so he took me to the hospital and, they evaluated me and everything like that. Turned out I had separated the right AC joint. I had twisted my thoracic spine. I was definitely in PTSD and, everything else from it. And so I started physical therapy and other types of things to, hopefully help with the experience of the pain that I was in. And yet I couldn't shake that impression that I had from those experiences, seeing all the experiences of unkindness and really feeling like that there was something to that. And so even though I felt like part of me hadn't come back up from the cliff, that I was still down there actually, like that I had died, because I felt like that I would like walk around the house and I would try to put my hand over candles and things just to feel something because I felt so numb and disconnected. And I had horrible nightmares every night where I was replaying the accident. The driver's face changed. And over time, I remember one time the face actually was my own. And so it was like, recognizing my part in choosing to be in that car and not listening to that little voice that had been speaking to me right before I got in the car that I hadn't mentioned yet. That was also that same voice that said, push up on the roof of the car when we were going over the edge. And so all these things were happening and I was in so much pain. And yet on the surface, if you just looked at me, I actually looked still quote unquote perfect. You couldn't really tell that I had injuries other than the poison oak. And so, anyone that was seeing me didn't really understand how much pain physically and emotionally and spiritually that I was in. And so one night, I remember when I'd had just an awful nightmare, a stupid, lucid dream of the car again crashing. I felt this urge to write. And so I took out this little journal that I had, and on the cover it said, "Awaken from the dream within." I still remember it. And so I started writing, and the first thing I wrote was, "The instant is all there is." And that began a series of journal entries that I began to make whenever I felt this motivation. I don't even know how to explain it other than that, just inspiration to write. And it seemed like whenever I was writing, I wasn't feeling the pain. So my motivation was definitely coming from a place of pain. And yet when I was writing, it was as though time stopped. And I was in this place of quiet and of healing. And I kept wondering about this. Why was I shown those images of unkindness? And how could kindness be something that was so important that it was the last thing literally that I was going to be aware of before I was pretty convinced that I was going to die? And so as I was journaling all these things, I showed them to my mother, who has always been curious about things. And, she's been a spiritual, student on her own. And she had actually had studied A Course in Miracles and even had taught classes on it when I was growing up. But I'd never read the book. It was just that blue book that was in our house. And we had people come to our house every week for her study groups. And I remember asking her, like, Mom, how do I explain what you do? Like, to kids at school, like that's just weird. Like, you people come to our house, and she's like, yeah, but this is very helpful to people. And so I was like, okay, well, so I didn't need to know what was in the book, but I knew it was helpful. And she was never forcing to me about needing to know it at all. So here was this thing that I'd been exposed to and yet had never read, never had looked at. But I had seen definitely the transition of my mother in her relationships and her evolution as a person from doing this work. And so I knew that it was something that was very powerful. But so when I showed her my writings and I started reading them to her, it was almost like that there was this just like shared simpatico between the two of us, where like her part was to take my writings and then she shared them with a friend of hers who knew and was connected with Ken Wapnick. And my mom knew him too, but in a different sort of setting. She'd gone to some classes with him and everything like that, but this person was working with him. And so she said, my daughter started writing these after she had this accident, and I just can't help but think that they're meant to be shown to you, to this other woman that worked with Ken. So she read them and she was like, oh, wow, these are really beautiful. And your daughter wrote these? Like, oh, okay, well, do you mind if I share them with Ken? And my mom had said, sure, go ahead. So then a few months later, I get a phone call and it's from him. And he's saying that he's read my writings and that they're amazing and beautiful, and that I shouldn't ever feel forced to write them, that there's no urgency to them. And whatever I did, don't read any other spiritual texts at the same time. That obviously I was having some sort of experience and that I should just allow it to be part of my healing from this whole experience as well. And that I must have, said yes, basically on some level to this. And at this point, and I told him about the things that I had been shown about the unkindness. And he said, well, yeah, that's what's true is that those are the things that matter, looking at those things, but with kindness. So can you look at your unkindness with kindness? And I was like, oh, well, that's different. And so he offered to be my mentor. He offered to read anything I wrote. He offered to be available by phone whenever I needed it. And I promised him that I wouldn't read anything else, and that I wouldn't open A Course in Miracles, and that I would only write when I felt connected to the meaning of it, and not feel any urgency to it. And then about 6 months after that, he reached out to me and said, okay, today's the day. If you want, go ahead and open that blue book. And that began my relationship, not only with Ken, but also A Course in Miracles.
I'd like to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring this ad. Hey guys, I want to take a minute to offer an opportunity for those of you who've been searching for a mental health therapist and haven't had any luck getting callbacks. I know it's challenging to find help, so I've partnered with BetterHelp. They are the world's largest therapy service, and they are 100% online. With BetterHelp, you can tap into a network of over 30,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with a wide range of issues. To get started, you just answer a few questions about your needs and preferences in therapy. That way, BetterHelp can match you with the right therapist from their network. Then you can talk to your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether it's via text, chat, phone, or video call. You can message a therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you. If your therapist isn't the right fit for any reason, you can switch to a new therapist at no additional charge. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you'd expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you. More scheduling flexibility at a more affordable price. Get 10% off right now on your first month at betterhelp.com/rockyourshine. That's betterhelp.com/rockyourshine. Now back to our episode. God, it's so powerful. There's I have so many questions, and I want to just talk about, because I've listened to a lot of near-death experience stories in the last 30 years when I really started to get interested in this idea of, when we transition out of our physical bodies. And, and many people who are into that have heard of that we go through our life, what's the word, a life review, and
Mm.
which sounds like very quickly that happened with you with the unkind moments and meeting and self-compassion, meeting all of our experiences with compassion the way we would with a child, because I think that is truly where so many of us struggle, is meeting our challenges and I don't think of them as mistakes. I think of everything as life experiences, but we call them mistakes, and meeting those mistakes with compassion, because I think that we are the only species that beat ourselves up over something over and over and over and over again. So I thank you for sharing that, because that's what I thought of when you were saying, in that flash of a moment, you saw these unkind things. So now you're with your mentor, Ken, and you spend, I think you said 13 years with him.
Yeah, total time that I worked with him. And I mean, I was doing other things at the same time. I was, I was married at one point, and then I got divorced, and then I moved to Los Angeles, and I had a Pilates business there. And I was at the same time still doing my journaling, still going to Ken's classes, and still staying connected to him. So I was very much, being in the world, but not of it. And really, on one level feeling very integrated, and yet on the other level still feeling very disintegrated from my true self and my authentic self.
So take us on that ride, because it sounds like a lot happened in these years that you're learning the Course in Miracles, you're practicing the Course in Miracles, because I want to hear you had another near-death experience when you had your miracle child. Before
Mm-hmm.
we jump into that, was that after you lost Ken? Did that happen after
It
his death?
did. Ken actually came to me in that near-death experience with my baby. So, like I said, he has been at the foundation of really everything on my self-healing journey.
So he dies, and his death has a tremendous impact on you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take it from there and where that leads into this next chapter of your life and your miracle baby. What happens with you after Ken dies?
Well, it was sort of similar to how I felt after the car accident, where I felt like that it just couldn't be true. And that, I mean, I almost felt like I had died. I felt like that my one connection, the one person that saw me fully and loved me fully beyond any sort of, romantic relationship, anything like that I'd ever known, but somebody that actually expressed true kindness and compassion, and that lived his work with everyone and everything, and that didn't take it all so seriously. All of these things that he had demonstrated to me. And A Course in Miracles says that to demonstrate is to teach. And he demonstrated what is possible when you align yourself with a thought system that comes from a place of unity and of oneness rather than separation. And so when he died, I felt immediately untethered from this world. I felt like I was floating out, like, basically in inner space, like just there was no gravity in my life. I felt like I was just going through the motions, and that the one person that I could call, that I could send all the crazy musings that, my mind would come up with, or my inner voice would guide me to, or if I had a question about a client or anything else, because Ken is also a psychologist. So I was able to talk to him about, I have this client who's having these kind of issues. Do you have any insights, or do you have any, I've had this dream. He was so good at helping me look at dreams. And so I would tell him about my really lucid dreams that would be overwhelming to me, like where I couldn't even articulate them. And then he would walk through them with me. And he was always available. And he always made himself, even if it was like 30 seconds, he would get on the phone with me and he would be like, Nanci, are you taking yourself seriously again? And he would get me to laugh. And I really learned that if you can't laugh at something about yourself, there's no way you can change it. There's no way you can heal it. And that if you're stuck in it
I love
being
that.
if you're stuck in it being serious, like he would always say, it's silly, not sinful. And that the real Holy Trinity with looking at your ego, quote unquote, is that you would smile at it sweetly, giggle at it gently, and tickle it tenderly, that you would not judge it. Because when you're judging something, then you're giving it power and you're making it real. And so here was everything that I felt like, that even though my life on one level was working, like professionally, I was doing really well in Pilates, but whenever I would have some relationship issue with someone I was dating or something like that, it would derail. And so, I could be such a good teacher, quote unquote, of everything that I was learning, but I wasn't integrating it into my own life and into my own relationships and my own experiences personally. And so what was I to do? Here, I felt completely lost. I felt as though he had left way too soon, that there was no warning. How could somebody who had never smoked a day in his life have stage 4 lung cancer? Like, it just didn't even seem possible. And why would that happen? And I remember he was telling people as he was very, very, very sick, and he would say, I'm not dying. And I think they took that to believe that he was going to get better, that he was going to heal.
Physical body, exactly, right.
But what I realized after that was that he knew he wasn't dying because, according to the thought system that he very much believed and lived and practiced, he had never lived because he had never left God. And so the Ken, quote unquote, that we all knew and that we all, had never been here any more than any of the rest of us. And so he wasn't dying because he had never really lived. And yet, if you were looking at it through the lens of being a physical body, it would be very easy to misinterpret that and see it as that, oh, then he should have healed physically. So that was one of the things that I really have come to know through working with him, and then also my own experiences, is that healing doesn't have anything to do with physicality, and true healing is not linear in any way, shape, or form. And that you can have an experience of healing from something in your past right now that you hadn't even thought of, or what you weren't putting any intentional effort into. And likewise, you can have something in the future that, is happening right now as well. And that now is the only time that really exists. And so all of that is happening. And I'm very aware of all the metaphysics of A Course in Miracles. And I believe it on every level in my own life. And yet I'm devastated by this loss. And it's just, I'm untethered. Like the untethered soul. I felt like the untethered. I was just floating around, going through the motions. And yet nobody really knew that part of me, the Course in Miracles side of me, because I kept those very, 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 hidden. And so with my clients and stuff, they all kind of, they knew I was kind of woo-woo. And some of them even called me like the Pilates witch or Pilates angel or any of these other things. But I didn't talk about A Course in Miracles. I never told anyone unless I was super duper close with them, because it's not about trying to get more followers. It's not about trying to, convert people or anything. It's a self-study curriculum.
It's the way you live your life.
So it was, and if people were curious about things, if they were like saying, well, how did you do this, differently with this relationship, or how were you able to forgive this person or something, then I would tell them what it was that had helped me, but I never was forcing or pushing anything on anyone. So it was like, I was going through all this grief, and yet I couldn't really share it with anybody other than like my mother, really, who also knew Ken. So, it was this very isolating sort of feeling. And then after about a year of that, I felt this call again to write. And I wrote about the experience of losing him on this post on social media. And it had all of these responses from it. And I talked about, the first moment of grief frozen in time forever. And that's how I felt. But then I realized that by looking at that with compassion for myself and with the gentleness and with, how Ken would have approached things, that the way that I would really demonstrate that he didn't die was that he was living within me, and anyone that he touched, that I would demonstrate the legacy of kindness that had always been something that was meant for me, I believe, to know and to understand. And so that really formed the foundation of the work I was doing, and the writing that I was doing about kindness. And then curiosity also came into it without judgment. And so that kind of, led everything into that place. And then it was like, from that moment that I wrote that article, that I had gone through all the grief, I'd gone through all the despair. I didn't deny any part of it. I fully owned it, but without guilt and without needing it to be any different. And then I was able to let go of it more and more and more. And if I think about it, I still get teary-eyed and I still get misty, about him, quote unquote, not being here. But I talk to him every day in my mind, and I have dreams about him a lot still. And I get to listen to his recordings and everything, and they help me feel grounded. And so I do know that he's always with me, and that I get to be an extension of that. And so that is what finally, not finally, but it led me to this other impossible thing, quote unquote, like Alice in Wonderland talks about in my life, of being able to look at all of my relationships that had been unhealed and making a list of them. And for 1 year, I told myself I wasn't going to be in a dating relationship, quote unquote, with anyone other than myself. So I was going to date myself. I was going to get to know myself. And I went through that list of unforgiveness, and I made amends with every single one of the people that were on that list. And it didn't matter what their response was. They didn't have to do anything at all. And some of them were more, contentious than the others, but it was more about, I knew that there was something to what I had seen all those years ago, and that it was possible. And so I was able to go through that entire list. And at the very bottom of that list, I realized that it was my ex-husband, and that he and I had been married, divorced, and that he'd always been kind of, quote unquote, the love of my life and soulmates on so many levels. And yet we weren't together, and that I had had this whole other life now in Los Angeles separate from him. But we kept on having these situations where we would like bump into each other. And he doesn't study A Course in Miracles. He doesn't, do anything, quote unquote, spiritually. And yet he was drawn to me by as much as I was drawn to him too, kind of like that he was my grounding into this world. And yet I was allowing him to see what was possible beyond it too. So we had this natural attraction for each other, but when we were younger, we had also this repellent for each other too. And so, in the time in between, we had been working on ourselves. I'd obviously been going through this 1 year relationship with me, and he'd been doing his own things as well. And then we kept on bumping into each other and finding each other. And I mean, I share about it in the book because it's too impossible almost to articulate in this short period of time we have today. But suffice to say, our paths kept crossing and crossing and crossing. And then finally, we decided to see if there was something there as far as a friendship again. And then that friendship very quickly transitioned into more than friendship. And lo and behold, I found myself pregnant with our now miracle baby girl, who is 6.5, going to be 7. And I didn't think that it was going to be possible, because that was one of the things that had broken us up in the first place, was that I was born with this weird anatomy. I have 1 kidney, 2 uteruses, and that, all these things and anatomically had told me that I couldn't be a mother biologically. And so it was kind of like that when we got divorced, originally, that it was like, well, who am I then? Or what am I if I'm not able to be a mother, if I'm not able to have a family traditionally? And I know there's other ways of having families, but I just didn't see that for us. And so I left, and I went and had my family be the clients that I ended up working with and getting to see, even if they were older than me. I was kind of their mother. And so I had all that experience, and I had processed that grief again of not getting to be a mom. And so here I was pregnant, didn't think it was going to happen at all. And fast forward through a very complicated terrible
well,
pregnancy.
I was going to stop you there for a second because I had that feeling that this was probably a very hard pregnancy.
Yes.
And so you got back together you got back together, you guys got
Mhm.
married, you got
Yep.
pregnant. Now you're pregnant. This is a very probably, did they say that this would be a hard pregnancy? Were they concerned about the pregnancy? Because you
So
said two
doctors, yeah,
uteruses. I've never heard of that. So that's
yeah,
sounds,
it's called uterus didelphys, and it's very, very, very rare. So when it's a Mullerian duct anomaly. I know all these big words now, and that when you have that, there's a really high likelihood that you're going to have a preterm labor because the baby's not going to be able to grow sufficiently in this space. But luckily, she was conceived in the larger of the two uteruses. And unbeknownst to me, which is what made the pregnancy so difficult, the uterus actually completely twisted with her in it. So it kept her from coming early, but it made me pass out all the time during the pregnancy. And that was one of the other near death experiences that I had where I opened the book with that and passing out. And here I am pregnant. And I'm thinking that, wow, I got this far and that maybe this is it. And then I was able to, do all these tests, and the ultrasound doesn't show the twisting. So the ultrasound showed the baby was fine. It showed everything was okay. And they couldn't understand, why are you keep passing out? Why did your blood pressure keep tanking? I couldn't sit with my feet on the ground. I had to curl them up on one side of me. And if they were down on the ground, I would lose consciousness and pass out. And so all of this is happening. Nobody knows what's going on. I'm thinking for sure that I'm going to die at any moment. And so I'm completely surrendering to the idea that, well, maybe this whole purpose was for me to be kind of this vessel to bring this baby as far as I could. And that this was just another lesson, in my self-healing journey, basically. And so when I made it to the C-section that was scheduled, because luckily the doctor, who was a high risk OBGYN, said, I know your regular doctor says we should just wait and see if you can go to natural labor, but I think that we should schedule a C-section. And that saved my life and my baby's life, because by having it scheduled, they weren't going to be, giving me Pitocin. They weren't going to be trying to have me go into natural labor. With the twisting, when they opened me up for the C-section. And so there I am, totally numb and everything like that. And I'm holding my husband's hand and we're waiting to meet our baby girl. And they go, "Where's the baby?" And I'm like, "What? What do you mean, where's the baby?" Like, how could I be 39 weeks pregnant and have you say, "Where's the baby?" And then luckily another specialist in the OR, he's like, "Oh, I see her. She's twisted." And so they had to manually untwist the uterus, which then my baby swallowed all this amniotic fluid. I hemorrhaged, but they're focusing on the baby. So they weren't even aware of what was happening to me. So they get the baby out, they hold her up as fast as they can. And I just hear silence. And I'm like, oh, this isn't good. And I see her. And then I finally hear a little cry, very, very, very weak. And they're like, "We got to get her to the NICU." And luckily the hospital we were at has like top of the line NICU place. And so I remember the first decision as a mother, quote unquote, was me looking at my husband and saying, "Go with her, don't stay with me." And so when he left, I didn't get to hold her. I didn't anything. And then I started to feel really, really, really cold. And I was like realizing that the room felt like it was darker. And I had been able to have some music playing in the room with me. And I had asked if it was possible to hear a class by Ken, a recording on kindness. And so I'm hearing Ken's voice as all this is happening. And he basically asked me this question that I had heard in a dream. Before I reconnected with my ex-husband, I had a dream about me being pregnant and having a baby. And I hadn't told anyone until that point, other than one person. And in the dream, I was asked, "Will you give your life for her?" And it was a little girl. And I said yes in the dream. And so in the dream, I died. And I felt myself leave and everything, and the baby was born and everything was fine. So then here I actually get pregnant, and I am like finding out that it's a little girl, even though I already knew it was a little girl in my heart, and terrified because I know the dream that I had, and dreams that I've had in the past have come true, some of them. And
So
I
so
thought
at
maybe,
this moment you think you're gonna die.
yeah. So I'm there and I'm getting colder, really cold. And I know that they're not noticing me because they were all focusing on the baby. And I couldn't even really like articulate what I was feeling. And my husband isn't there. So no one's there like next to me, like watching what's going on with me because they're thinking about her. And I was getting colder and colder and colder. And I could feel basically like that there was less of me there. And then I hear the same voice that I heard in my dream. And it says, "Will you give your life for her?" And I said, "Yes." And I just made this complete surrender to that. And I thought, well, at least I won't be cold anymore. Right. And then I had done my part, that I'd been that vessel, that I brought this little girl. And now I was so sad that I wasn't going to get to meet her, but that hopefully she would be loved by her dad. And so then the voice changes and it's Ken's voice. And he says, "But you don't have to." And he said that true love doesn't demand sacrifice, that it's a choice made once beyond time and space, experienced as eternity. And I heard that. And then as soon as I heard that and I took it in and I actually received it, I heard another voice in the room next to me who was the anesthesiologist who was like, "Oh, no, you don't." And she jabbed this needle into my shoulder that stopped the bleeding. And I was okay.
That's I mean, I could feel that when you were telling me that story. True love doesn't require sacrifice is one of the most beautiful ways I've ever heard it put. I'm just imagining listeners taking that, really taking that in, right? Because you can apply that to all of our relationships.
Yeah. And I've been able to remember those words with my own daughter, and that I didn't have to give my life to have her here.
And she gets her mom, and you get to have her.
And she's been my greatest teacher of kindness.
Wow. I can't explain what I'm feeling inside my body right now, actually. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your story with me and all of our listeners.
Thank you for letting me tell it.
I always end my interviews on two questions. I can't wait to hear your answers. What does self-love mean to you?
It's like that experience of exhaling after you've been holding your breath. Self love is everything. I mean, it's life. It's what allows you to show up and be a conduit of love for others.
Thank you. Finish the sentence for me. Hope is.
Always possible.
Thank you, Nanci. Is there anything you would like to say to our listeners that I haven't asked you?
What I would want to say is that now is always the perfectly imperfect time to begin living your best life. And that even if it seems painful, even if it seems impossible, to realize that when you truly believe that nothing is impossible, then that means everything is. And it opens everything up. And when you become the consistency, knowing yourself, being able to say who you are, what you are, without defense, without explanation, without apology, when you own that, when you own it fully, yes, we have our things from our past that maybe we'd want to do differently. Who doesn't? But when you can share all of you as you, then you become the consistency in an inconsistent world and an inconsistent life. And so you navigate from that clarity, from that groundedness, from that truth. And it allows you to be effortless in being you. And so all of your relationships change with everyone and everything, including the one with yourself, because now the sameness is you. And that allows you to experience healing on a totally nonlinear, cosmic, timeless level.
Thank you. Thank you deeply for coming and sharing your light.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all my listeners. And I know that each of you will take whatever it is that you need to hear today. And thank you for showing up. Thank you for your support. I love you all. Bye for now.